Should Christians be rich, or is it more spiritual for us to avoid riches altogether and just live some humble, modest life? That is coming up next on The Beat. Hello, my friend. Welcome to The Beat. My name is Alan Parr. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If this is your first time here on this channel, we answer frequently asked questions about the Christian faith. We talk about dating and relationships from a Christian perspective, and we do all sorts of other Bible-based videos as well. So if you're new, consider subscribing. So if you're just joining us, we have been in a series on Fridays going through the book of James. I want to say this is our 6th or 7th video. I actually lost count. But if you missed all of those, I want to encourage you to go back and watch the other videos in this series. And we have now come to a very, very practical part of the book of James, talking about the question, should Christians be rich? Well, in the book of James, it is clear that he is speaking to two different groups of people. If you will recall, in James chapter 2, he talked about the importance of those who are rich not showing favoritism to those who are rich and looking down upon those who are poor. And so clearly there were some rich people in this assembly and also some poor members as well. Also, there are some Christians and there are some people that are just visiting and they're not Christians. And so it appears as though the group of rich non-Christians is the group that James is going to be talking to here. And so as we're considering this question, should Christians be rich, I want to suggest that James is going to talk about two things in this passage. Number one, how they are acquiring their wealth, and then number two, how they are using their wealth. Let's pick it up in verse 1. It says here, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you." That does not sound good. Clearly he's talking to rich people who are not saved. And it says here, "Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire." So essentially what James is saying here is that all of your wealth one day is going to eventually corrode. It's going to waste away. And on the day of judgment, it is going to testify against you. Now, how did they acquire their wealth? Well, first of all, it says here that they hoarded it. It says, "You have hoarded wealth in the last days." And so he says essentially, if this is the way you're getting rich, where you're taking everything. Now, there's a difference between saving money and hoarding money. Saving money says, you know what, I'm going to put some money aside because I may give it away to someone else. I may give it to my children. I may use it for godly principles. But hoarding says, you know, I'm going to take as much money as I possibly can and keep it all to myself. And he says, this is what these people were doing. But the second way that these guys were getting rich was even worse. And it was because they were cheating people out of their wages. Notice what it says here in verse 4. "Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty." So this is really bad, right? In other words, instead of them being generous to the poor, they were cheating them out of their wages. And so basically, essentially what it looked like was this. In Jesus' day, 80% of the population would be considered at a poverty level. They were either in one of two groups. Either the first group was that they were day laborers. In other words, they would go down to the marketplace and they would try to offer themselves out to work that day. And then there's another group that were just too poor to do anything. They were either lame, or they were orphans, or they were widows, or they were lepers. They weren't allowed to be around other people, and they just weren't able to work at all. And so because a lot of the people were poor, God had to institute certain laws to ensure that the poor people were taken care of. And let me give you several of them. Number one, the Bible taught that they were to immediately pay people as soon as they delivered their work. Don't you hate it whenever you do a job for somebody and it takes them like weeks to pay you? The Bible teaches that whenever somebody does something for you, you pay them immediately. The second thing that God did in order to care for the poor was to release all debts every 7 years. Now, wouldn't that be great if all your student loans, all your car payments, all your house payments, all your credit card payments were just simply released every 7 years? Essentially, God did this so that it would not be a society where the rich kept getting richer and the poor kept getting poorer. The third thing that God did was that there were certain laws in the Old Testament set up to take care of orphans and widows because these were certain groups that weren't able to take care of themselves. The fourth thing that the Old Testament says that God did was he set up interest-free loans. Wouldn't that be great if you could just borrow the money that you need in order to do whatever you want to do with it and then pay that amount back? Well, in the Old Testament, that's exactly what God told them to do. He says, you know what? Don't take advantage of your brother who does not have the money to pay for something by giving the money and expecting them to give you more back later. He says, no, don't charge them any interest. The fifth thing that God did was that if you were a harvester in the field and you were picking up crops, he says, I want you to purposely leave some crops on the ground. Don't pick all of them up and give it back to the field owner. No, leave some there purposely so that if the poor come behind you, they can pick up some of the crops for themselves so that they will have something to eat. And then finally, every 50 years, there was something called the Year of Jubilee. And this is when God cleared and erased any type of debt. So let's say you had to sell your land that was given to you as an inheritance that should have belonged to you and your family, but you fell in hard times. You had to sell your land. God says, you know what? I'm going to restore that to you and your family every 50 years. Once again, to make sure that the rich don't get richer and the poor don't get poorer. So should Christians be rich? Well, the first question I would ask is, how are you acquiring your wealth? If you're acquiring it in an honest way, then I don't believe God has anything against you being rich. The second question also now is, how are you using the wealth that God has given you? And here we see in verse 5 and 6, it says this: you have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. In other words, he's saying, you know what? Here is the problem. You are just living for yourself. You're buying things for you. You're hoarding things. You're self-indulging. You see something, you want it, but you're doing it all for you, and you're not giving anything else away. He says here, you have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. And then he says, you have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Now, this is very interesting. Essentially, what the rich were doing in that day is that they were using their riches to bribe the judicial system so that the guilty would go unpunished. And then the poor who were innocent, who were not able to defend themselves, would actually be punished. And God says, you know what? This is a wicked use of your money. So if you are a Christian and God has blessed you with a lot of money, what does the Bible have to say about how you should be using your money? Well, let me jump outside of James for a moment and take you to 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. It says here, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant. So the first thing he says here is this: if you are rich and God has blessed you, don't flaunt it. Don't be arrogant with it. Don't put it in front of other people. Live a modest, humble life if God has blessed you. The second thing that he says here is that we should not put our hope in wealth. Why? Because it is so uncertain. And so if God has blessed you with a lot, there is a temptation to say, you know what? I don't need God because I have my 401k, I have my bank account. He says, no, if you are rich, it says here, but put your hope in God. Let's continue reading. It says here, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. And so that's the third thing. If God has blessed you to be rich, then you know what? He's blessed you to enjoy the fruit of your labor. In other words, don't feel guilty or bad that for whatever reason God has blessed you to be rich. He says, you know what? God has blessed you, and simply enjoy your riches. The fourth thing that he says that we should do good things with it. He says here in verse 18, command those to do good and to be rich in good deeds and to be generous and willing to share. And so he says, hey, if you are rich and God has blessed you, you should do good deeds with it. You should share it. You should be willing to give it away to those who are in need. And then finally, he says, you know what? God will bless you not only in this life, but in the life to come. It says here in verse 19, in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves. In other words, whenever you manage your money well and you give it away, you're essentially laying up and storing up treasures for yourself in heaven as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. And so once again, the question is, should Christians be rich? Now, I don't personally see any reason why Christians should not be rich, particularly in situations where when God knows that somebody is going to use that money for godly purposes, willing to share and give to those who are in need, why would God not bless you with even more? Question of the day: what is your perspective on money? Should Christians be rich? Should they not? Leave those in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. If you like this video, hit the like button. Don't forget to share it with your friends. Be sure and subscribe. Check out some of the other videos on this channel. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time on The Beat.